welcome to the Goodwood Revival, and more specifically our friends at Bonhams Cars, who tomorrow, or today, are going to be selling an incredible amount of astonishing cars. So we thought we would introduce you to just a few of the most important ones, starting with this. This is a Porsche 911, it's a 993, but it's no ordinary 993. You see, this one has been nicknamed the Last Waltz because it is the last air-cooled 911 that Porsche, well, that ever rolled out of the factory. Now, there are some technicalities to think about here. Jerry Seinfeld owns the last ever 993 made. It was a Carrera 4S, and it was built in March 1998. This one was built just before that, but because this one was built to custom specifications, it went away for 6 months to what Porsche calls its Sonderwunsch department, which stands for special wishes. By the end of the 6 months it spent having some upgrades and additions done, that made it the last one ever to be delivered. Now, there's a few more special things about it, apart from the fact that it has as much power as the turbo of its time would have done, and this is just an ordinary Carrera, and it has this beautiful ocean blue paint on both the outside and the inside, and even on the calipers, the brake calipers. But inside, because this car was finished on the very day that Ferry Porsche himself passed away, it has a little plaque there just to commemorate that. And just to let you know how important it is, on the door sills, I think on the driver's side, it also has a plaque to say that this was the final one ever built. It could be yours this weekend. It's only done 11,029 kilometers in its entire life, so it will fetch you, cost you about £800,000. But if that doesn't tickle your fancy and you happen to have £800,000 burning a hole in that pocket of yours, we have an alternative, and it is this Aston Martin Ulster, also for £800,000, slightly older. We'll come to that one in a sec. This was built in February 1935, and it is one of the famous Aston Martin Ulsters. It wasn't one of the team cars that specifically raced, but it was a reserve car for the TT in Ulster that year. It has a bit of an interesting history after that, because it went on to be the demonstrator car and was driven by press. It received some pretty high praise, and then one of the journalists, well, he went and crashed it. In most cases, sort of crashed press cars, well, they either get crushed or actually they mostly get crushed, but this one sort of, they didn't really know what to do with it. So it, to use the words that Bonhams have used, languished at Aston Martin Works for several years, until a man was having a look around and looking at other cars that he might buy, and looked over there and said, "What's that in the corner? I quite fancy it." And they went, "Yeah, do you want it?" So he bought the crashed remains of this Aston Martin Ulster and had it returned to its original specification. Since then, it's actually been bouncing around several different owners. It's been used its entire life. By 1983, this car had done 86,000 miles, which, for that, is pretty impressive. It's now in pretty much perfect original spec with a full restoration, and the current owner passed away a few years ago, which is why it's for sale. £800,000 for an Aston Martin Ulster is quite cheap, actually, and I mean, tell me that is not one of the most beautiful cars, especially of the 1930s, that you've ever seen. But again, if you're feeling a little bit different to that, but you want an Aston Martin, we've got another rare choice for you. You see, the story goes that in 2001, Dr. Ulrich Bez, who was the head of Aston Martin at the time, was a judge at Pebble Beach. And he was a judge alongside a man called Andrea Zagato. I'm sure the name Zagato means something to you. Between them, they hatched up a scheme to create a special limited edition Aston Martin, which was this, the Aston Martin DB7 Zagato. Now, there's a few things that make it a Zagato over a normal DB7, and they're quite noticeable. Firstly, take a look. It's only got 2 seats. This is in fact the body of a DB7 Volante convertible that's been chopped somewhere around here and shortened. It's then received that beautiful double bubble roof that you get from every single Zagato, and a slightly restyled front end, which, to be honest, I think looks better than a normal DB7, and here you go, an Aston Martin DB7 Zagato. They only built 99 of them, and because it's slightly shorter, it's actually lighter and faster than the original, and it has a little bit more horsepower. The 6-litre V12 now has 400 horsepower. So if you want a faster DB7, if you want what I would arguably say was a prettier DB7, there's no other way to get it. This one, in case you're wondering, is number 28 and will cost you somewhere between 200 and 280,000 pounds. But what if you, say, had a lot less money for that and you fancied racing a car at the Goodwood Revival maybe this weekend? Would there be a car for you? Of course there would. Look at this. Now, you have to be a very specific kind of person to want to race a 500cc Formula 3 car, because it is, well, I mean, it makes a go-kart look safe. 500cc Formula 3 cars, quite simply, they have a 500cc motorbike engine in the back, they have a steering wheel, and they have 4 wheels. That's it. It is, in fact, unique. It was built by a man called Brian J. Rousell, which is why it's called a BJR, and it's quite sophisticated for its time. It's got a tube frame chassis, which you can entirely see in there, and the suspension at the front is wishbone and coil, and swing arm entirely at the back. It raced mostly around the southeast back in its time. It raced at Goodwood, apparently, and it was deemed by our competition department to be unique enough or special enough that it has been invited to race. So if you're looking for something that'll get you into the Revival, one of the cheapest ways, because it is 25 to 30,000 pounds, then that's probably it. And think about it, it's about the same price as a second-hand Hyundai i30N, so you'd probably be a bit more exhilarated in one of those. Now, let's talk about more British racing cars, and perhaps the glory days, or the first glory days of British racing, because before Jaguar was the team in the 1950s, there was one sort of highlight that the British motor industry had, and that was MG in the 1930s. It's one of the reasons we celebrated MG at the Festival of Speed. This is an MG Magnette K3, a supercharged one. This is the exact car that Tazio and Nuvolari won the TT in Ulster in 1933. It also won its class in the Mille Miglia in the same year, and it had various other racing successes over the years. It's possibly one of the most important MGs, if not the most important British racing cars in history. Under the bonnet is a little 1,100cc supercharged engine, but 120 horsepower. 120 horsepower from that tiny little engine in this tiny little car. What an incredible thing that must have been back in the day. When it won the TT at Ulster, it won it at an average of 78 miles an hour. Now remember, the Ards TT course was a great big road course, kind of like if you think about the Isle of Man TT these days, that kind of really fast, very, very dangerous course. 78 miles an hour averaged over this length of a TT, and that was 4 miles an hour faster than any other car had done it before. Now after that was finished, it then did what cars would do back then. It went off to become a display car for MG, it went around dealerships to try and sell more MGs, it went on a big tour. And then a German man, whose name I don't have, turned up and said, I want to buy that. But he wanted to buy it in a slightly different spec. And this is where the history of this car for a little while got slightly iffy, because they didn't really want to transform this car into that spec. So they got the body in a different spec, put it on another chassis, and then ground the chassis number off this car to hide it. And then, for all intents and purposes, the German man owned the original car and he went off and raced it around the world. And then sometime, I think in the 1990s, this chassis reappeared. And they noticed that where the chassis number was meant to be on the chassis, someone had ground a few of the zeros off in roughly the same way as they thought would have been done originally. Forensic experts were brought in to check if underneath that they could find whether it originally had the same chassis, and it turned out that yes, this was the original Nuvolari car that had just been missing for the last, what was it, 60 years by that point. So here we are, one of the most important cars in British racing history, now back and available to you. Again, that'll cost you about 800 grand. Might seem like a fair amount, but when you consider it'll get you a 20-odd-year-old turbo that's a road car, this actual piece of history driven by Nuvolari, yeah, I would take that. Also, it was driven at the Festival of Speed this year. Speaking of great British racing teams and cars, our next featured car is this. It is, well, you know, it's a Ford Escort. It's an Alan Mann Racing Ford Escort. It's one of only 3 that survived, but this one, well, this one is actually unique. Now, Alan Mann entered several Escorts into the British Saloon Car Championship back in the 1960s. This one is specifically raced in 68 and 69. Back then, a little bit of background, the British Saloon Car Championship was split into multiple classes, and anyone from any class could win. You got all the points from your certain class, and whoever had the most points in your class won. So it could be a Mini, or it could be something as big as a Galaxy. Alan Mann Racing entered Escorts into Group C, which had slightly smaller engines. But they came up with a little bit of a trick. This one was given what it called a supercharger upgrade. It doesn't actually have a supercharger. To all intents and purposes, what it actually has is a small electric fan blowing some more air into the engine, but that's not the point. The point was that this had more power and technically a slightly larger engine, so it went into Group D. Group D was for the bigger cars, the Falcons and the like. And what they hoped was that maybe every now and then this car would take a few points off the big boys and help the cars in the Group C class win. And actually did pretty well. It was raced by some pretty special people, including Graham Hill, who added his own little touch to this car, because inside there is an extra switch from any other Escort, simply for the reason of turning off the brake lights. He wanted to turn off the brake lights, I quote, to not give away too much to his rivals. In other words, he didn't want to show them where he was braking for specific corners. But I guess that's what makes you a Formula 1 world champion. 200 to 250,000 pounds if you want that. I think it's pretty cool. One more in here is all the way over here. We've got to go past some pretty special stuff here. There's a rather nice Elva there. There's a recreation, but there aren't many of those around, a recreation of a Jaguar XJ13 over there. There was only ever one of those. It was crashed in period. And one of the ones that's been rebuilt is worth 20-something million pounds, but that one, pretty much exactly as it was, will cost you a lot less. What will also cost you a lot less, and possibly get a few more looks on the way, is this. Now this is the answer to the question that no one asked. And that question is, what if you took a Model T and put a V12 in it? Yes, no, nobody cared. Actually, it's the answer to the question, what happens if you built a Model T that was meant to take a straight 6 engine and then shoehorned a V12 under the bonnet? It was built by a man called Gary Belcher, who was sort of the king of hot rods at the time. And this whole thing is completely custom. There's no Model T in this whatsoever, but it is unique. So what he wanted was a Model T hot rod of his own, and it was meant to have a Jaguar straight 6 engine, an XK engine, which is, we're celebrating XK engines this weekend at the Goodwood Revival. Think XK 120s, think E-types, think beautiful cars like that, not this. But then a group of his rivals brought out cars with XK engines, and he decided it wasn't good enough. He needed to do more. So he bought a V12, a 5.3 litre Jaguar V12 engine, and he squeezed it into the space that would have taken the straight 6. And I say the space that would have taken the straight 6 deliberately, because it's too big. It doesn't fit. So there is some major problems with this, but they got around them. So there's no fan. There was no space for a fan at all on this radiator, which causes, as you might guess, some cooling problems. But ingenious solution, he mounted 2 extra radiators underneath the chassis to help with cooling. There's also some other cool bits inside the 2 chassis, because it's very simple. You can see it's got 2 very long chassis rails. He hid the electronics for one of the radiators in one side and the steering rack inside the other to give it this incredible look. In fact, whatever you think of it, it's got some proof that it is incredible, because one year Gary was on holiday in France with his family, and when he tried to bring it back into the UK, it was impounded by French authorities. I'm not quite sure why they did, but on the books and on the official forms when they impounded it, they called it a work of art, not a car. Interesting. Anyway, 3 more cars outside. Got a few more interesting things out here, which there's so many things it's almost impossible to remember what we're supposed to be looking at. Beautiful Bristol over there, a very strange AML car, another Escort if you prefer the Mexico era. C1 Corvette, I absolutely adore those. A Fiat Jolly, we're actually going to walk past a Fiat Jolly because there's another beachy thing here that's a little bit more relevant. A Myers Manx dune buggy, yes. If you're here this weekend or you're watching on the live stream, you know that we're celebrating the Myers Manx dune buggy with a beautiful opening parade every day, and they've just released their brand new electric one. But that's not what this is. This is the original. If you don't know what a Myers Manx is, well, underneath it's a Volkswagen Beetle, a 1300 to be precise. It's still got the 1100cc Beetle engine in it, except it's been stripped of everything and given, well, a much cooler look. Now, I don't think it really works that well on a slightly rainy September day in Sussex, but just imagine instead you are in California and it's almost any time of the year and it's sunny and you're driving along in your dune buggy that sounds ridiculous and looks incredible. That's perfect. Also, 2 more reasons why dune buggies are famous. Firstly, obviously, the Thomas Crown affair, in which Steve McQueen had his own one commissioned and built, but Bruce Mayers himself actually beat the motorbike record for the Baja 1000 in one of those, which is not bad. Speaking of off-roading in competition, that brings us to this, and I think this might be, step around the puddle, this might be the one that I would take home, because, I mean, who doesn't love Mercs of this era, especially a 450 SLC like this, and especially even more, one that has been made for rallying. Now, for the 1978 WRC season, Mercedes decided it wanted to get involved, so it built a load of homologation specials of the 450 SLC, including, well, this one. It then went and rallied for several years. This one, unfortunately, didn't actually rally. This was the backup car, it was the practice car for both the Safari rally that year and later on the season in Côte d'Ivoire, where Merck finished 1st, 2nd, 3rd and 4th. This was then, after they'd finished rallying, this one was actually completely dismantled, as were most of those 450 SLCs, and they were just stored for years and years and years and years until 2000 and I think it was 2007, when a company in Slovenia bought the whole lot and decided that it was going to restore them to perfect condition, and that is what we see here. And you know what? I am a massive fan of the WRC, and I think cruising around in one of those, that's definitely the coolest car here. But there's one more car I want to show you, and it's right down the other end, and we're going to have to walk past some Aston Martins. We're going to have to walk past more Aston Martins. That is a very rare Bentley Continental GT Pikes Peak edition. And if you ever wonder whether we actually do these things during setup, there's some wires and cables down there. A Bristol for fans of slightly odd looking British cars of the 1950s and 60s. What else have we got? Ferrari F430, one of the stars of my youth. Over there, there's an Audi Sport Quattro. The cameraman currently hates me. A Capri, if you want to race at members meeting. But the car that I actually want to show you is over here, because possibly one of the prettiest cars ever made must be the Lancia Aurelia, especially a GT. This one, I think, might be my favourite that I've ever seen. Now, the Duke of Richmond owns an Aurelia, but it's black, like most of them are. Look at this, in turquoise, and turquoise was the original colour for this car. It is, in fact, a racing one as well, because it's raced multiple times at the Goodwood Revival. So, if you want an alternative to the little F3 car that we saw earlier, and you've got a little bit more money, this, how about this? Sounds incredible, looks amazing, it's Italian and it's turquoise. 80 to 120,000 pounds sounds like an absolute bargain to me. Those, I think you agree, are some absolutely incredible cars, and if you want to see how much they sell for, tune into the live stream right here on the Goodwood Road and Racing YouTube channel, or check out the results on GR&R over the weekend.